Hi everyone and welcome. If you're a regular on my channel, then you might have already seen my video from earlier today where I had set out to remove some worms out of one of my bins where I'm trying to migrate the worms out of the castings. And I got kind of tangled up in some other stuff, and then I had other things to do, and I had to cut my plans short and pull away from taking care of what I had hoped to get done today. And if you're like me, unfinished business can just gnaw at you. It can really drive you crazy, especially when what you want to do is a fairly simple, straightforward thing. So I'm back down here in my wormery. It's now almost 11 o'clock at night, but I just somehow felt like I couldn't call it a day until I had this taken care of, because it's not that complicated. It shouldn't take too long at all. So I shot down here with the camera really quick to try to get this job done. So the bin that you see down here is the bin that was on the table earlier, and we had set out to get into the feeding zone in order to pull the worms out and get them situated in their new home, and then just get this feeding zone reloaded so that the process may continue. But it's been 8 days now since this was set up, and you can see the level has significantly dropped. So the worms do seem to have depleted the majority of the food that was given to them, or at least so it appears. And I'd like to hope that we've got a good number of worms hanging out in here. But like I said, this is not complicated. I got my little temporary holding tray here. I'll usually just scoop out the worms from the feeding zone, reload the feeding zone, put the bin back up on the shelf, and then get the collected worms moved into their new home, give them a chance to get situated into their new place, and call it a day. So no biggie, right? Let's get this thing done. I guess like I'll do sometimes, I'll sometimes just try to scrape off some of this stuff that appears to be free of worms and simply avoid taking it over unnecessarily. In fact, it's probably good stuff to include in the rebuilt feeding zone once we get down to redoing the feeding zone. So I'll just make a little pile of it over here. The material has a nice texture to it. I'm already starting to observe a few worms sticking out of the material. So we might not have to dig much deeper to get to where we're headed. Get back in there, buddy. You're going over. Cool. Let's give this a go and see what we ended up with here. The other bin from which I extracted worms earlier today was actually a finishing tub. And I'll leave a link to that video in the corner of the screen for you in case you'd like to check that out too. In that extraction of worms, we had mainly tiny baby worms, newly hatched worms. Because it's a finishing tub, it's not really an active composting tub anymore. It's a tub full of castings, which is still pretty heavily populated with newly hatched worms emerging from the cocoons that were in the finished castings when it was harvested. So when we looked at all those worms that had been assembled in the feeding zone of that bin, they were mainly very small, tiny little baby worms. And here I'm kind of expecting to see a better variety of worms, possibly a greater number of larger worms. So I think we've got the majority of what we were after here. So like I said, this wasn't going to take a great deal of time, right? So what I'll often do is even give this material a little bit of a chance to rest under the bright lights, at least for a few minutes, so that any worms that can see the bright light have a chance to dive down, and that would also give us an opportunity to sort of reclaim some of this uncomposted material off the top of the surface here and keep it in here rather than move it over with the worms. Although, technically speaking, there's really no harm or foul by moving them over with some of their existing material. I like to see how many worms I've got too, if possible. So I'm going to give this the time that it needs so that the worms can settle down into the material, try to withdraw from the bright lights overhead, and then we'll get them into their new space. So in the meantime, while I'm allowing that to happen for a few minutes, I'm going to go fetch some food that I can use to rebuild this old bin, and then we'll proceed to releasing these little guys. Not much to see here. I'm going to kill the camera for now, and we'll be back in a few minutes. So in case anyone's curious, the food that they're getting here is some really nasty looking rotten lettuce and some green beans. Also got a little bit of coffee and grit to include. So why don't we begin rebuilding this, and then we can proceed with the release of our worms. We've got a fair amount of reclaimed bedding type materials over here. So I think I'll probably just start by laying that stuff down to begin with. So I'll just take some of this leafy stuff, start dropping it back in. This looks like the rind of a cantaloupe. And it's really the only remaining chunk of food from what I can tell in this feeding zone other than the leafy material, which is obviously food too, but I treat it more as bedding. Everything else in this pile looks like it's just bits and pieces of worm castings, which I can also leave out here with the rest of the material. I'm only going to try to reuse the more bedding type materials out here. Wow, that's pretty interesting to see. I'm not sure this worm is even alive anymore. I don't think it is. The little guy's just covered in mites. And the mites appear to be devouring the carcass of the worm. And I guess that's one of the beneficial aspects of your mites. I'm sure they're helpful composters of the material in the bin, but they're also useful in eliminating the remains of dead worms. I'm sure they've got other useful functions too, but I've been seeing a lot of them lately. It seems like with the increased moisture in the air, with the humidity rolling in with the summer weather, it's definitely increasing the moisture level in all of my bins, certainly limiting evaporation big time. So my bins are a lot more damp than they usually are. Over the past few weeks I've been attempting to compensate for that in various ways. So I think we've got a pretty good collection of reclaimed bedding items here. We're going to complement that with a little bit of fresh leafy material out of my collection of leaves from outside. Alrighty, we're getting there. Now, let's not forget about this material that was resting on top of our collected worms. Not sure how deep the worms would have gone by now, but I'm sure if I start poking around, I'll see them. So I'm going to just start retrieving some of this off the top here. The other reason I'm interested not only in just seeing how many worms have come together, but I've also been weighing these. I guess my main reason for wanting to get a rough idea of how many worms I'm moving over here is because of the bin that we're going to be dropping them into. I've been roughly keeping track of how many worms have been placed in there, just using rough estimates using the weight of the worms. So if possible, we're going to try to reduce this pile down to what we consider to be mainly worms. We'll get an estimate of approximately how many worms we've managed to pull together here, so I can try to maintain a semi-realistic tally of how many worms I've got in that new bin that they're going to be moving into. So that's my main interest in wanting to try to reduce this pile down to mainly worms only. And maybe the feeding zone is just not that interesting to the worms in the bin anymore because the majority of the food supply has been depleted. So in order to keep this migration action happening, we've got to keep an eye on the material in the feeding zone to make sure it's not running too low. I'm going to let this sit in the light again for a few minutes here, because we've still got a couple other fresh food items to place into this feeding zone. And then maybe we can even skim a little bit more of this off the top. So now this stuff is going to just go right into here. It may look like a generous amount, and I would agree with you if you thought so. But as you just saw, after 8 days, with the exception of the skin of the melon that had been placed in here 8 days ago, there's really no signs of any of the other food that they were given. So I want this feeding zone to be enough to sustain the movement of the worms for a little while. So I'm wondering if maybe checking back in here a little bit sooner than 8 days would be a good idea for the next go around. I've got a little bit of coffee here. I emptied the coffee maker, and this is pretty much the only coffee I've got at this point in the house. I think it's going to come in pretty handy here to give our feeding zone over here just the right mix of delicious food items that's going to draw the crowd in. I'm also going to throw a little bit of grit on top, just in case the grit in the bin is running low. It's hard to tell or gauge where that stands, so I'm going to replenish. So I've been taking little bits and pieces off the top of the pile that the worms are in, checking it to see if there's any worms and moving it aside, gradually giving the worms a chance to retreat down into the material. And this is what I did not capture in the video earlier today, was me trying to do this with what had come out of the feeding zone of my finishing tub. Somehow the material in that tub was just so damp that I was just simply unable to separate at all. And that material didn't have big chunks like this either, which complicated things. And on top of that, like I said earlier, the worms occupying that material were mainly very, very tiny baby worms. So I mean, here we have a fairly small worm cruising around on my middle finger. That guy's huge compared to the worms that I was dealing with in that finishing tub, because the majority of the worms coming out of there are worms that actually were hatched in that container pretty recently. Quite possibly worms that are days old, only a couple days old, maybe even a day old. Tiny worms, itsy bitsy worms, barely visible. So you would pick up some stuff like this and it would be teeming with little worms you can barely see. And it just felt like it was a futile effort. So I basically gave up. I did manage to isolate some worms in that process, get them relocated. So I might have managed to move over. There again, it's a hard estimate, because if you're looking at a pile of worms but they're tiny baby worms, there could be way more worms in that pile than you can imagine, because you might be kind of dialed into looking at a pile of worms that are this size, you know, a good mix of adult worms and baby worms combined together. But when you got a whole pile of almost all tiny baby worms, you have to imagine that the numbers must be sky high. So I would imagine that a single worm like this, as far as weight is concerned, must weigh, 10 times, 50 times as much as a brand newly hatched baby worm. Oops, getting myself a little crossed here. It's getting late, late in the day, so this will be done soon. I'm just fiddling here a little bit more than usual just because I am interested in seeing what kind of a haul we managed to get together here. This is really the way it should work, I think, when you got some nice loose castings that break away nicely from one another, or even material that's still got some good sized chunks in it. It's so much easier just peeling off the evacuated material from the top and setting it aside. If this stuff is just a big pile of goo, it's virtually impossible. So I believe we're getting pretty close to the worm ball that resides somewhere down in this pile. You can see we're assembling a pretty nice collection of not yet broken down materials that we can once again return back into the bin, into the feeding zone, to help cover up what's going on here. So why don't we do that, give ourselves a little bit of room, as well as giving the worms a little bit more time to dive down while we're taking care of business over here. Guess this will get me a last chance to snag one or two worms that are still in this material as I spread it around, if I can spot any. Definitely got some small worms here. This little guy's pretty small too, but still nothing compared to some of the worms I was dealing with today. I don't know if the right word is frustrating. It was just a futile effort, you know. I don't feel like I got frustrated because I like to use new experiences as a learning opportunity. I always go into every situation open-minded with the clear possibility that I might fail horribly at what I'm trying to accomplish. So when it happens, if it happens, I don't get terribly upset. I just try to learn from the situation. And as you could see, you know, if you had to give this migration a rating from 1 to 10, I guess it would probably receive a pretty low score because it's certainly not an impressive collection. So perhaps 8 days was just not enough time to really allow a huge number of worms to assemble. So maybe what we'll need to do in this next go around is wait maybe 2 weeks before we come back in here. Or maybe another thing we could do is just check in periodically to make sure that the food hasn't been depleted, because the presence of food in our feeding zone is a pretty important variable for the successful migration of the worms. And you know, even if you've done this dozens of times, as I have, you're always at the mercy of all kinds of different environmental conditions, different factors that are different every time. So there's no silver bullet, as far as I'm concerned at least, that's going to ensure consistent results every time. It's always best to be prepared for surprises. And I was a little surprised because typically doing this stuff is fairly straightforward. But I think the added variable of a great deal more moisture in the air and humidity lately has influenced the results I've been getting in some of my activities down here in the wormery. So just got to remain flexible and adaptable, and things should go pretty well for you. So hopefully you'll agree with me that we've probably managed to skim off uncomposted materials pretty successfully here. I mean, I'll admit I probably did haul over a number of worms. You know, all you got to do is just look at a little tiny chunk of what I moved over and you'll see 2 little baby worms in there. So maybe we'll just bring them back to be with their parents. Don't want to break up a family. And you'll see that we've got ourselves a little pile of worms over here, making me wonder, is it worth weighing it? Might not be worth weighing it, you know. I mean, I think another good way to try to come up with a rough number here is to poll the audience, which is what I've done in my previous video, and I got some good feedback. Because there too, I just decided not to bother weighing it. I came up with some estimates. I got some input on that, so thank you to those of you who chimed in previously. But I believe we're at the point where we're not going to go crazy with this. We're going to proceed to the next step and get these guys situated in their new home. And then I can call it a night. And I can rest easy without that pesky feeling of unfinished business being out there. So, all right, let's set these little guys aside briefly. Since this feeding zone over here looks just like the rest of the bin, I'm going to go ahead and mark it. So I've got myself a coffee filter, which is my traditional way of marking the feeding zones in my bins. And I'm going to restore the plastic that was resting over the feeding area. And the function of the plastic is just to allow for the recirculation of moisture. Here we're allowing moisture to evaporate. There we want to keep the moisture recirculating so that the material is nice and damp, because that's the way the worms like it. And that's what we want. We want a place where the worms are drawn to, a place that they like, a place that they want to stay once they get there. And that's why the plastic is here. But you know what, really quick, as long as we're here under the lights, I'd also like to try to gauge our progress. Maybe we're getting low turnouts in our feeding zone because maybe we've already successfully evacuated the contents of the bin. Like you can see already, that is not the case. We start stirring around the material, especially down low where the material is a little bit more damp. We're encountering a fair number of worms hanging out down there. So we're going to try to promote ongoing drying of the material by taking some of that more damp material up off the bottom, and at the same time sending some of the more dry material that's resting out here on the surface down low, hopefully helping to equalize the moisture level throughout the bin. But even though we're encountering worms here and there, I don't think we've got a huge number remaining in this material. I think we're doing pretty good on the evacuation, but it's by no means done yet, so we will let it go for a while. A couple more weeks, see how things progress. Maybe we'll even pop in along the way just to make sure things are progressing in the right fashion. Do anything we can to help the process, such as replenishing the food in the feeding zone if need be. And maybe even stirring up the material to help equalize the moisture levels again once the surface has dried off a bit more. If you're noticing that my voice is a little lower than it normally is, it's because this house is ventilated with forced hot air, so there's vents down here in the basement, even though I've got them shut most of the time. I'm not going to send heat down here unnecessarily in the winter, but the upstairs apartment that I rent out, which I don't know if I've mentioned that before, but I've got rentals upstairs, and I don't want to be sending my voice up there through the ductwork, because I know they've got a little girl up there probably sleeping now since it's getting late at night, and I don't want to be disrupting people trying to rest upstairs, because the noise does definitely come through the ductwork. When I'm down here tending to my worms, I can always hear the family up on the top floor, because their voices carry right through the ductwork, which runs right above my head. So I'm just trying to be courteous and not make a racket that they'd be able to hear up there. Alright, so I think we're doing pretty good here. Material still has worms in it for sure. Gonna need a little bit more time to migrate. The material is also drying out pretty nicely, getting nice and crumbly. So that dry stuff that was coating the surface has been sent down lower. The dry stuff off the bottom has been tilled up to mix in with the dry stuff, hopefully helping to equalize things throughout the bin. As things dry out, the worms will eventually start seeking more comfortable places to be, and hopefully they'll soon stumble on the feeding zone where the moisture should be recirculating because of the plastic. Oh, it feels so good to get this done. It's like a monkey on my back all day long. Alright, let's get these guys back up on the shelf. And proceed to the task at hand of releasing our collected worms. Now here in my newest bin, it's the last of my bins actually, I believe, that still uses plastic to cover up the surface. And that plastic actually has been taped to this covering to make it much easier to handle, and I really like that. It's just a new idea I tried here on this bin for the first time, and I like the way it's working. After I released the worms that I had collected earlier today into here, I had also administered a feeding. So right below the surface there's fresh food added and everything like that, but we're not going to monkey around with any of that. We're here to release worms, so let's get to the matter at hand. I'd love to hear people's ideas on how many worms we've collected here. I know it's not much. I'm going to try to show them relative to the size of my hand. Let's see if I could scoop the majority of them out here. It's not that many, but I would have to guess at least a couple hundred. I mean, if it was a pile this size of newly hatched baby worms, I would have to estimate that it was, 5 times as many. But since this looks like it's mostly mature worms, I'm going to guess that maybe we've got a couple hundred or so in here. So I'd love to hear people's ideas as to what they think we've got here as far as the count of the number of worms. So let's give these guys a chance to relax in their new space and get acclimated and dive down to get out of the light. Alright everyone, I think the show's over. I don't see any more worms here. I just got back from washing up a little bit. I've already removed my glove. I washed out the tray that the worms were in. And other than that, there is still a little bit of cleanup to do around here, but luckily not much. But I'm not going to keep you around for that because that's boring. I'll go ahead and take this as a chance to say thank you for sticking around. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, then as always, please remember to give me a thumbs up. That's really appreciated. And also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching.